I desperately needed a break from the flat, boring scenery back home, so I decided to treat myself to a solo mountain getaway. I set my sights on Colorado, but the main tourist spots were way out of my budget. So I took a gamble and booked a cheap Airbnb in a tiny remote town I'd never heard of. The options were slim, but I found a place that looked decent enough. 1 week later, I was suffering through a grueling 10-hour drive across the country. By the time I finally rolled into town, the sun had already set, and honestly, I immediately got a bad feeling. I wasn't expecting luxury, but this place was unsettling. It was just a few rows of houses bordering a pitch-black empty road, lined with old rotting power poles that looked like they were about to snap. In the dark, it didn't look like a vacation spot. It looked like an abandoned ghost town. I told myself it was just the lighting, but that was my first impression. Luckily, I found the rental without getting lost. I pulled onto a gravel path that led into a small cul-de-sac shared by my Airbnb and 4 other tiny homes. I grabbed my bags and headed inside. It was a small place, maybe 500 square feet, but the interior was actually surprisingly cozy. I dropped my gear in the bedroom and headed to the kitchen to fill up my water bottle, finally ready to decompress. But as I stood at the counter, I heard the crunch of gravel outside. I walked over to the window and watched a pair of headlights cut through the darkness. A car crawled into the cul-de-sac and parked directly in front of the house next door. The engine cut and the lights went black. But weirdly, as I stood there watching, nobody ever got out of the car. I figured I was just being paranoid. It wasn't my business, and I didn't want to be the creep staring through the blinds, so I went back to the kitchen. I sat at the bar for maybe 15 minutes, texting my family that I'd arrived safely before deciding to call it a night. I went to the bedroom and started unpacking, but the silence was broken by the sound of a car door slamming shut outside. Then came the footsteps. They crunched over the gravel, sounding unnervingly close to my wall, but I assumed it was just the neighbor walking to their front door. Then the walking stopped abruptly. No door opening, no keys jingling, just sudden silence. I tried to shake it off and climbed into bed. I managed to fall asleep, but about 30 minutes later I snapped awake. I didn't know what time it was, but a heavy feeling of dread washed over me. The house was dead quiet except for the faint creaking of the floorboards. I sat up, squinting into the pitch-black room, trying to figure out what woke me up. My eyes scanned the room until they landed on the uncovered window. And there they were, a pair of eyes, staring directly at me through the glass. My heart stopped. I froze completely, unable to breathe. After a terrifying second, the figure pulled away from the window. I could hear faint shifting sounds, but it didn't sound like they were walking away. It sounded like they were moving around. Panic set in. I jumped out of bed to throw on my clothes, but then I heard a noise that made my blood run cold. It came from inside the house, right on the other side of my bedroom door. I froze, listening. Suddenly, heavy footsteps thundered away from my door, sprinting down the hallway. I stood there, paralyzed, listening as the footsteps ran out the front entrance, across the gravel, and into a car. The engine roared to life, and they sped off. After a few minutes of terrified silence, I crept out into the hallway. The front door was standing wide open. The person hadn't just been watching me from outside. They had been inside the house while I was sleeping. I drove 20 minutes to the nearest police station to file a report, but nothing ever came of it. I have no idea who that man was or what he planned to do to me, and honestly, I didn't stay long enough to find out. I finally reached my last stopover before the end of the trip. I was completely drained after days of driving, so I just grabbed my backpack and dragged myself into the Airbnb. I hadn't vetted this place at all. It was just a random house off the highway that happened to be on my route. I figured I just needed a mattress for 8 hours, so who cares? But the second I walked in, I got hit with this nasty smell. It wasn't necessarily a danger smell, but it was gross, like mold in the walls or a dead rat rotting under the floorboards. I did a quick sweep of the place, and I realized the stench was way worse in the bedroom than the main room. I made an executive decision right there. I was sleeping on the living room couch. I grabbed a throw blanket and started getting comfortable when, boom, a massive thump vibrated through the walls. It didn't scare me as much as it confused me. It was way too loud to just be the house settling. The weird thing was, the acoustics of the place made it impossible to tell where the sound actually came from. I walked down the hall and peeked into the rooms to check for... well, I didn't even know what I was checking for. Everything looked normal, so I told myself not to worry about it. I went back to the couch, laid down, and pulled out my phone to check my route for the morning. But just a few minutes later, thump. It was exactly the same sound, just one loud, singular bang. This time I didn't just peek. I got up, marched down the hall, turned on all the lights, and inspected the walls and ceilings. But even with the lights on, there was absolutely nothing out of place. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a heavy tree branch was swinging in the wind and hitting the roof. It felt like a stretch, but I was desperate to sleep. I told myself, I'm only here for one night. Whatever is wrong with this house, it's not my problem. I killed the lights, laid back down, and passed out. Because the house was quiet and I was dead tired, I went under immediately. But sometime later, I woke up in a really strange way. I was still half asleep, groggy, and eyes heavy. I probably would have just rolled over and gone back to sleep, except for this sudden sinking feeling in my gut. I opened my eyes, and my heart absolutely stopped. There was a man standing directly over me. He was staring right down into my eyes, my entire body locked up in pure terror. It only lasted for a split second, because the moment he realized I was awake, he bolted. He took off from the side of the couch and sprinted straight out the front door into the night. I scrambled up and ran to the door to see where he went, but he had already vanished into the tree line. I slammed the door shut and turned around to grab my phone to call 911. That's when I froze again. I looked down the hallway and saw what I had missed earlier. The ceiling panel was open and a folding ladder was pulled down, leading right up into the attic. I didn't waste a second calling for help. It turned out the thumps, and probably that smell, were coming from him. He had been hiding up in the attic the entire time. The police figured he was just a squatter using the Airbnb as a place to crash, but that doesn't explain why he came down. He wasn't just living there, he was watching me sleep. If I hadn't woken up at that exact moment, I honestly don't want to think about what would have happened next. I'm writing this down while it's still fresh in my mind, because this actually happened just a few weeks ago. I had booked a secluded Airbnb cabin deep in the woods as a base camp for a backpacking trip with some friends. I arrived 2 days early to get settled before everyone else showed up. When I pulled in, it was exactly what I was looking for. Super isolated, very rustic, and completely quiet. I parked around the side, unloaded my gear, and since I was exhausted from the drive, I crashed pretty much immediately. The next day, my only goal was to scout the trailhead. I needed to make sure the path wasn't washed out or too muddy from the recent rain before my friends arrived. I took it slow, drank some coffee, and around mid-afternoon, I walked the half-mile down the road to check the trail. It looked dry and clear, so I turned around and headed back. I was gone for maybe an hour, tops. But as I walked back up the driveway towards the cabin, I stopped dead in my tracks. There was a strange truck parked right in front of the house. I hurried up the path, confused and a little on edge. I walked right up to the truck's window and cupped my hands to look inside. It was empty. I spun around, scanning the woods and the road, but there was absolutely no one. It didn't make sense. There was nowhere to hide. I walked up to the front door and tried the handle. It was still locked. I let myself in and did a sweep of the cabin. It was clear. Nobody had come inside, which was a huge relief, but it made the situation even weirder. I pulled out my phone and messaged the host, asking if he or a maintenance guy had stopped by. While I waited for a reply, I kept checking the windows. The most unnerving part wasn't just the truck. It was the fact that in this open, wooded area, I couldn't see a single soul. The driver had just vanished. The hours dragged on. It was just me, the cabin, and endless miles of forest. I kept watching the truck, expecting the driver to walk out of the woods, but nobody appeared. As the sun began to set, the truck became a dark silhouette against the trees, and my anxiety spiked. At 8:00 p.m., my phone finally buzzed. It was the host. The message was short and terrified me. No one else should be there. Deep down, I already knew that, but seeing it in writing made it real. I couldn't stay there. I didn't feel safe. I immediately started throwing my gear back into my bags to leave, but just as I zipped up my bag, I froze. Heavy footsteps crunched onto the front porch. They walked right up to the door and stopped. I waited for a knock. Nothing. Silence. After a terrified minute, I crept up to the window to see who was there. A tall man was standing on the doormat, but the weirdest part, he wasn't facing the door. He was facing away, staring blankly out at his truck in the driveway, completely motionless. A wave of cold dread washed over me. He looked like a statue. I had a feeling he might be signaling to someone else in the woods, so I slowly took a step back, trying to retreat to the bedroom to call 911. Creak. On my third step, the floorboard groaned under my weight. The reaction was instant. I heard the man spin around on the porch, and a split second later, the doorknob began to rattle violently. I sprinted to the bedroom and locked myself in, dialing 911 with shaking hands. The man was slamming against the front door, trying to force his way in. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the banging stopped. I heard him run off the porch, the truck door slammed, and tires screeched as he sped away. The police arrived pretty fast, but the guy was long gone. I didn't stay to ask questions. I drove straight to a hotel. They never found him, and I have no idea what he wanted. But the thing that keeps me up at night isn't the attack itself. It's the timing. That truck was parked there for hours before he came to the porch. Where was he that whole time? Was he watching me from the tree line, hiding under the deck? All I know is I'm done with isolated cabins for a very long time.